In the previous installment, we looked at the prehistory of Nosgoth. However, there was one item that was purposefully left out, because to speak about it would bring a lot of other things into question. However, the events as I've outlined previously are the Vampire-Hilden War. This war occurred because the Hilden refused to adhere to the religion of the vampires. They rejected the Elder God and his Wheel of Fate, which is to reject the idea of birth, death, and rebirth, and instead to embrace immortality. The genesis of the Pillars. The ancients created the Pillars in order to put an end to the war. These pillars would allow them to cast the Hilden into the demon dimension and seal them there forever. The formation of the Circle of Nine. 9 sorcerers were chosen, each tied to the principle on the pillar for which they represented, and their combined magic was used in order to cast the Hilden from the material plane and into the demon dimension. The affliction of the Blood Curse. As the Hilden were being outcasts, they cursed the ancients with 3 pains. They were made sterile, inflicted with a terrible thirst for blood, essentially turning them into vampires, and made them immortal. Immortality was the worst of these curses for the ancients, because it estranged them from their god, who turned his back on them and fell silent. The dark gift is past. Most of the ancient vampires were driven to suicide because they wished to return to their god and to the Wheel of Fate, and over time they would diminish in numbers, so that the pillars began to choose human guardians to preside over the pillars, which caused distress to the ancient vampires. In order to maintain their control over the pillars and the delicate balance that has fallen over the land, they began to forcefully pass their dark gift on to the humans. In the human revolt, this is where we are now. The Sarafan Era. The timeline begins to get a bit complicated at this point. It was prophesied that the Hilden would be granted a champion who would then free them from their prison within the demon dimension, and they would one day roam the material plane once again. The Hilden champion would only be defeated by a champion or messiah of the ancient vampires, who would wield a legendary blade. One of the ancient vampires, Janos Ordran, asked a swordsmith to create this powerful blade, and thus the Reaver was born. Janos and his brethren then placed powerful magical enchantments upon the Reaver blade, so that it would devour the blood of its enemies and feed, causing the blade itself to strengthen whenever it would kill. Janos was also charged with protecting and passing on the blade to their savior, essentially making him the 10th guardian of the Pillars.
At the time of the binding, 9 guardians were called to serve the Pillars, and I was summoned as the 10th guardian, the keeper of the Reaver, the weapon of our salvation. Over time, our race died out, until I alone remained, sustained only by my obligation to you and by my guardianship of the blade.
Janos also turned the swordsmith into the first vampire, Vorador. Being the first to be turned, Vorador was incredibly powerful and became an apprentice of Janos in the early days of Nosgoth's history. At this point, human guardians were being chosen by the Pillars of Nosgoth, and the ancient vampires would abduct them and turn them into vampires when they came of age. However, the humans rejected this ritual and their dark gift, and so revolted. In order to wipe out the vampires' influence on the humans, the Circle of Nine, now occupied by human guardians, created the Sarafan.
It was during these dark times, infested with the plague of the undead, that the Circle brought the Sarafan to existence. Trained to be devoutly loyal to the Circle and the perfect exterminators of the undead scourge, they were led to many victories by the righteous Paladin, Malek, protector of the Pillar of Conflict. They cleansed the vampires with fire and released their souls to more blessed realms. There is no wrath as terrible as that of the righteous.
The Sarafan Brotherhood was formed at an undetermined point in Nosgoth's early history, triggered by a rise in the number of vampires. This threat to human populations caught the attention of the Circle of Nine, who established the vampire hunting Order of the Sarafan, and sponsored their fanatical crusades to eliminate the vampire menace. The Sarafan were led by the protector of the Circle and conflict guardian at the time, Malek, and over many years Malek proved to be a capable leader and guardian, leading the Brotherhood to many victories, decimating entire vampire bloodlines and causing suffering to many vampires, especially Vorador. The Sarafan Brotherhood slaughtered Vorador's family, friends, lovers, and children, over the course of their infamous purges. The Brotherhood would enter something of a golden age, as Raziel, alongside his comrades Terrell, Dumar, Rahab, Zaphon, and Malchiah, would join the Sarafan, and they would soon be promoted to the ranks of elite Sarafan commanders, with Raziel as their leader, seconded only by Malek himself. At the height of the Sarafan Crusades, the Sarafan commanders began plotting the murder of the last ancient vampire, Janos Audron. They saw him as the origin of the vampire plague. Using Mobius's staff, Mobius was the human guardian of time, and following a strange creature, they were able to infiltrate Janos' lair and subdue him, using the Time Streamer's staff. Raziel then murders Janos and removes his heart, before taking the ancient Reaver blade. The triumphant Sarafan returned to their stronghold, where they christened the heart as the Heart of Darkness, believing it had the power to restore vampiric unlife. However, in the aftermath of their greatest victory, the Sarafan would suffer their greatest defeat, as the murder of Janos Audron provoked the ire of two of Nosgoth's most powerful inhabitants, a wraith and the same creature that they followed into Janos' lair, and the vampire Vorador. As the Sarafan retreated to the stronghold, they were already being pursued by the wraith, who gains entry and discovers the Reaver blade within. As he hesitantly investigates the blade, he is confronted by Malek and the Time Guardian Mobius. Mobius uses his staff to disable the wraith's weapon, and so the wraith is forced to wield the Reaver as his choice of weapon, which is in line with Mobius's hidden agenda. Meanwhile, in another part of the stronghold, Vorador has begun his own revenge attack, targeting the Circle for their sponsorship of the Crusades. As they cried for the aid of Malek, 6 members of the Circle of Nine were slaughtered by Vorador. But with Mobius keeping Malek occupied until the Wraith picked up the Reaver, Malek was delayed and arrived too late to save the Guardians. As the Paladin arrived, he was ambushed by Vorador and defeated in combat. But the old vampire left Malek alive, to suffer for his failure to protect the Circle.
Malek, defender of the Nine, and last of the Sarafan sorcerer priests. His vanity led to the slaughter of the Circle at the hands of the vampire Vorador. For his failing, his spirit was fused to a hellish set of magical armor. He has allowed no member of the Circle to fall since.
The Wraith, now armed with the Reaver, was invincible. He fought and murdered the Sarafan commanders, and even dispatched Raziel, their leader. The attacks on the stronghold at the very heart of Sarafan power proved costly for the Brotherhood. With the deaths of the commanders and the deaths of the majority of the Circle, whose sponsorship maintained the Sarafan, they fell to ruin. Most costly for the Order was the fate of Malek himself, who was punished for his failure to protect the Circle. His punishment was meted out by the surviving Death Guardian Mortinius, who imprisoned his soul in a suit of armor, leaving him disgraced and humiliated.
For fulfilling the Circle Malek of the Sarafan, you are hereby damned. The pleasures of the flesh are no longer yours. You have but one purpose, damned warrior. You will serve us for eternity.
But here I would like to reveal a major spoiler within the series, and it will serve to explain why I stated earlier that the timeline begins to get a bit convoluted. This powerful wraith that seemed to appear suddenly in Nosgoth's timeline, capable of wielding both the prophesied Reaver blade and capable of smiting down the famous Raziel, is not other than Raziel himself.
Here at last, in the flesh, I beheld my former brothers in arms, the warrior priests of the Sarafan Order, their lives devoted solely to the annihilation of the vampire plague. And while I confess I felt a twinge of longing, a pang of grief for what I had believed was my lost virtue, I regarded them now with none of the reverence I formerly felt. For I had seen the human face of the vampires, and now I beheld the monstrousness of these men.
And though this game series is entitled Legacy of Kain, for half of it you do play as Raziel. Raziel's destiny and character is almost as important as Kain's, however both their fates are intertwined. Nevertheless, as Raziel kills his former self, the suppressed Wraith Blade releases itself and changes the nature of the Reaver, causing it to turn upon Raziel and attempt to devour him. We'll have to return to this event in the future when Raziel makes the decision to enter the past and confront himself, for there are some things that cannot be understood except by following the story linearly. So for now, simply know that Raziel had travelled back and caused the downfall of not only Janos Ordran, but the Sarafan as well. With the past Raziel and his commanders defeated, and the members of the Circle now dead, the Pillars chose new Guardians, but the era of the Sarafan was over. The Sarafan were based off certain historical figures, such as the Roman Empire, the Knights Templar, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Knights of Malta. The chief trait being their religious crusades. In the case of the Sarafan, this would be their purges against the vampires. But before I can begin the next section on Blood Omen, it becomes necessary to begin talking about the timeline, and how time travel works within Legacy of Kain. From developer Amy Hennig, is it possible to escape preordained fate? And it's interesting to layer this question into a time travel story. This is really the whole crux of the time travel concept. Can you change history or not? And if so, what does it mean to change history? In terms of being responsible for the repercussions. I did some research into time travel fiction, in preparation for Soul Reaver 2. For me, the most interesting approach in time travel stories is summed up with the statement, you can't go back in time and change history because you didn't. That's my favorite way of looking at it. If you do go back, then you did go back. Which means that time travel is ultimately a journey of epiphanies, where the protagonist realizes the role that he already played in history. Of course, Blood Omen established that history can in fact be changed, and we'll be respecting this precedent in Soul Reaver 2. And then from series producer Andrew Bennett, initially Raziel naively believes that history is fragile and may be altered easily. He gradually comes to understand, however, that there is a conservation of reality at work, and that history is essentially immutable, that it requires a kind of temporal wildcard to change its course. Raziel ultimately realizes that his comprehension of Nosgoth's multi-layered, twisted past is much more limited than he initially believed. He also discovers that he continued to be manipulated by others who understand Nosgoth's history and the nature of time better than he does. Nosgoth's history, both past and future, was immutable, and by extension, each person's destiny was unchangeable within the time stream. Even the characters who knew that free will is an illusion found that resisting history was impossible, for they did not possess the intrinsic free will necessary to defy the rules of fate and predetermined events. This theory of predestination was a fundamental, indiscriminate constant and applied to almost all entities within the material, spectral, and demon realms alike. However, there is one exception to this rule. The only unbound creature who possesses true free will is Raziel. We'll return to this at a later time. However, for now, let's leave it at that. Raziel will come into play much later in the story, but for the next section, we'll be dealing heavily with Kain, the protagonist for which the series is named, in Blood Omen.